A story, a story. Don't go to bed, tell us a story. Hmm. Maybe, maybe I'll try one that I was practicing or thinking about for stories in the park. In Japan, there's a place called Dan no Ura, I believe. And around that place, there's a bay. And in that bay, you can find heike crabs. Now, these heike crabs have faces on them. And every time they're captured, they get thrown back into the ocean. And they've started to grow up in that area and be very famous. Now, the reason they throw these crabs back is because they have human faces on the backs of the crabs. These human faces are said to be members of the clan Heike, which the crabs are named after. Well, the souls of that family all ended up in that bay. The last souls of that whole entire clan all ended up in that bay during a great battle where they had been the ruling class, and after this, they were completely destroyed as a family. In fact, rather than being captured, grandmother took the infant emperor, who was only emperor because everyone else had been just minutes before killed. The grandmother took the infant emperor and dove into the ocean, drowning the last two remaining members of the Heike clan. Now, for many years after this, that area was left alone. There were so many stories, though, of people who would encounter these ghostly, fiery, glowing green globes. They would tempt them, they would make people curious, and people would follow them into the ocean and drown. They would be dragged places. They would come up and try to overpower ships, and it was just a bad, haunted place, really, for people to be in, and they just never stayed there. And then eventually they started to wonder about that Heike clan and decided that they would do something, try something new, and they honored the clan with a cemetery, a huge memorial listing all of the family's names and accomplishments and relations, and they had a lot, like a museum with everything about the family, honoring the family. Well, eventually, the area did start to get more and more people in, and this story is about a young man. He was a blind man, a storyteller, and one of his favorite stories that he had actually learned on the streets from the other storytellers in the area was of this Heike clan, this great last battle where the grandmother leapt into the ocean with the infant emperor. Well, being blind, he eventually needed support, and a friend of his was a priest at the Buddhist monastery who found him a home, found him a little place to stay at the corner of the monastery. One day, one night, Hoichi was this man's name. Hoichi was sitting on his back porch on a hot summer night, just listening and enjoying the peace of the evening before he went to bed. He heard heavy footsteps coming up the pathway, and they stopped at his gate. And they called his name. He heard a deep, deep voice, Hoichi. And Hoichi answered, yes. And the voice said, I have been sent. I have heard you tell the stories of this area extremely well. And we've gathered together an august audience to listen. Well, Huichi was excited and said, oh, I would really love to do that. I'll be there. But I'm blind. You'll have to guide me. And he reached out his hand, and a hand reached out and grabbed Hoichi's wrist and led him rather quickly down the road, around the corners and through the town. And Hoichi thought he knew where he was, and then all of a sudden there was a knock at a gate. Hoichi had never imagined that there was a gate at this place, and he thought maybe he didn't know where he was anymore. Well, he went in and he was ushered into the kitchen area, and the mistress there asked him to tell the stories. And Hoichi agreed, and she said that would be fine. They will be rewarded. We'd like you to be here. And so she showed him in and said and announced him, the storyteller, Hoichi the storyteller is here. And Hoichi asked them, what story? What story would you like to hear? And everyone together said, tell us of the Heike clan. Tell us of their history, and tell us of the great grand sacrifice of the infant emperor with the grandmother. Hoichi said, oh, this is such a long history. Let's do it in parts. You've asked me to be here 5 nights. So he began, and this was a great audience. Oh my goodness, this is one of those perfect audiences that knew the story but loved to hear it anyway. And every time there was a scary part, they screamed. And every time there was a sad part, they wailed. And every time there was a victory, they cheered. Oh, it was such a great evening. It was such a great telling. And Hoichi just loved the magic between him and this audience. Well, after he finished telling stories, the samurai who had come to gather him up took him home, and Hoichi went to bed. The next morning he told his friend, the high priest at the Buddhist monastery, what had happened and that he would be going out tonight. Well, this made the high priest a little interested, because he had not heard that there was any such audience in town. There was no visitors from or anything that he knew of. So he had the he had some of the younger priests watch Hoichi and stay with him if they could. Well, they didn't think it was going to be too bad of a project watching a blind man, and so they uh, kept their eyes open, and soon enough they did notice Hoichi stand up and leave. And he walked rather quickly, and then it started to rain, and they lost him. They wandered all over, back and forth. They couldn't find him anywhere. So they returned and told the high priest of what had happened. But in the morning, Hoichi went and told the high priest again, what had happened in the night, that he had had this great telling of that story again. And the high priest said, you gotta be careful. I haven't heard of anything. You gotta be careful. I don't know what's going on. So the third night, he said, definitely, you guys, he's a blind man. Stay with him. Why is it so hard? Told the younger priest to watch Hoichi carefully. Well, they did, and sure enough, in the night, Hoichi got up and left, and they tried to follow him, but again he went very quickly. And somewhere near that cemetery, he disappeared again. They went up and down the roads. They went left and right, and just as they were about to give up and go back to the monastery defeated again, they heard, well, it was just a feeling, really, but they saw those glowing green lights and ended up looking towards the cemetery, and they thought they heard Hoichi's voice. So they went in, crept in, and got closer and closer, and sure enough, down in near one of the bigger monuments, gathered all around were these tiny little dots of flame, green flames glowing everywhere. And right at the center, Hoichi was in the middle of the climax, where the grandmother leapt off the ship with the young infant emperor. Oh, they knew now what had been going on, and they knew that the high priest's worries had been accurate. And so they said to Hoichi, "Come, let's go, let's go." Right in the middle of the story, he got so angry. "What are you doing? What are you doing? So rude, so rude." And they grabbed him by his arms, one under each arm, just pulled him out of that cemetery and dragged him all the way back. Well, finally, it took quite a bit of convincing, but they did realize that Hoichi had been somehow bewitched and gotten tricked into thinking that all of those ghosts were people. Well, he finally believed his friend, and they decided they needed to protect Hoichi from now on. And so he said, I'm pretty sure on the fifth day your great reward was going to be something like being able to join them, as in die. So let's try to protect you." And the answer they came up with was to paint entire body of Hoichi with sacred scripts that would make him invisible to any ghosts. So they started. It was a long process. It started that morning. As soon as they thought up the plan, they went all afternoon, all evening, and finally the high priest said, "I really hate to leave tonight of all nights, but I have to go. I have to go do some business." Okay, so he said, "Let's just make sure that you're getting done, and these other priests will take care of you." Well, they did what they did. They painted every part of his body. And now, the interesting thing here that you gotta know is, for whatever reason, maybe they didn't see it, maybe they didn't think it was entirely necessary, but they did not write anything on Hoichi's ears. And then they told him, "All right, you should be invisible to ghosts now. I want you to just disappear. I want you to just sit quietly in the same place to make sure that, you can tell." And that was that. They left him on his porch at night, and pretty soon it was time. The usual time when he heard the heavy footsteps come up the walk, and he heard them. He heard the knock at the gate, and he heard the name, the deep voice, "Hoichi." Hoichi this time stayed silent as he was instructed. "Hoichi." And then he heard the gate open, the latch open, and up the path further, up the porch, and walking back and forth right in front of Hoichi. He could hear these heavy footsteps, and eventually he heard the samurai, mumble under his breath, "I see nothing of the storyteller, but 2 ears. Hmm. in order to show that I have obeyed to my best ability, I will take the storyteller's ears. And that he did. He grabbed each of those ears of Hoichi's and pulled and started taking them to his master. Well, that didn't work well. Hoichi had to freeze, and he stayed silent and through all of that pain as his ears were literally ripped off. Blood started oozing down, and Hoichi stayed silent, petrified with fear, all night long, until finally, well past midnight, maybe even early in the morning, his friend came back from the business he had to go to. The high priest walked up the path to check on Hoichi, and he slipped a little bit as he entered the gate, and he looked down and realized it was blood. He ran up to Hoichi, and finally he saw Hoichi sitting there frozen solid. He said, "Oh, my poor friend Hoichi, Hoichi, how are you? I'm so sorry, I'm so sorry. I see now what happened. I thought they would finish everything, and I didn't tell them they needed to do every single part of your body." Well, he got Hoichi taken care of. They gave him some bandages and took care of his wounds, and eventually Hoichi went back to telling stories. Now, though, he was called Hoichi the Earless, and he had this chapter that you just heard to add to his story about the Heike clan. A story, right? I like it too.